The dust cloud kicked up by the convoy rolled across the desert like a brown wave, coating everything in its path with fine Iraqi sand. Sarah Martinez adjusted her body armor and checked her medical kit for the third time that morning. As a Navy combat medic attached to a Marine unit, she had seen her share of dangerous missions, but something about this patrol felt different. The radio crackled with chatter as their Humvee bounced along the rough road leading into the outskirts of Fallujah. Intelligence reports had indicated increased insurgent activity in the area, but the mission was critical. They needed to deliver medical supplies to a forward operating base and evacuate wounded soldiers who had been waiting for transport for 2 days. Sarah's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, sat across from her in the vehicle. His weathered face showed the strain of months in the desert, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. He had specifically requested Sarah for this mission because of her reputation for staying calm under pressure and her exceptional medical skills. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles carrying a mix of Marines, Navy personnel, and essential supplies. Sarah's vehicle was the third in line, positioned to provide quick medical response if needed. The landscape around them was desolate, with occasional abandoned buildings dotting the horizon like broken teeth against the pale sky. As they approached a narrow bridge over a dried riverbed, the lead vehicle slowed down. The area was known for improvised explosive devices, and every piece of debris on the road could potentially hide a deadly surprise. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as they crawled forward at a cautious pace. The attack came without warning. The first explosion rocked the lead vehicle, sending metal fragments flying through the air like deadly confetti. Within seconds, automatic gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the convoy. Sarah's training kicked in immediately as she grabbed her medical bag and prepared to move. The driver of her Humvee yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, trying to find cover behind a concrete barrier, but they were exposed in the middle of the bridge with nowhere to hide. Bullets struck their vehicle with metallic pings and thuds, spiderwebbing the armored glass. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was already on the radio, calling for backup and trying to coordinate their defense. Sarah could hear the desperation in his voice as he realized they had driven straight into a well-planned ambush. The insurgents had chosen their location perfectly, with high ground on both sides of the bridge providing excellent firing positions. Sarah watched through the damaged windshield as Marines from the other vehicles took defensive positions and began returning fire. The sound was deafening, a constant barrage of gunshots and explosions that made communication nearly impossible. She saw one of the Marines from the lead vehicle stumble and fall, blood staining his uniform. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her medical kit and prepared to leave the relative safety of the Humvee. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison caught her arm and shook his head, pointing to the intense gunfire outside. But Sarah had taken an oath to help the wounded, regardless of the danger to herself. She waited for a brief lull in the firing, then sprinted toward the injured Marine. The distance felt like miles as bullets whizzed past her head and kicked up small explosions of dust around her feet. She reached the wounded soldier just as another wave of gunfire erupted from the hillside. The Marine had taken a bullet to his leg, and blood was seeping through his combat pants. Sarah quickly applied pressure to the wound while using her body to shield him from the ongoing firefight. She could hear Lieutenant Colonel Harrison shouting orders over the radio, trying to organize their extraction from the deadly trap. As Sarah worked to stabilize the wounded Marine, she became aware of a new sound cutting through the chaos. The distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds made her blood run cold. The insurgents were escalating their attack, bringing heavier weapons to bear on the trapped convoy. The first mortar round exploded 50 yards away, sending a shower of rocks and debris raining down on their position. Sarah continued working on the wounded Marine, knowing that moving him too quickly could cause more damage. But with each passing second, their situation was becoming more desperate. She looked back toward her Humvee and saw Lieutenant Colonel Harrison gesturing frantically for her to return. But there were now 2 more wounded Marines who needed immediate medical attention. The convoy's medic from the lead vehicle was nowhere to be seen, and Sarah realized she might be the only medical personnel still capable of helping the injured. The sound of helicopters in the distance gave her a moment of hope, but the aircraft were still too far away to provide immediate assistance. The insurgents seemed to sense that time was running out for their ambush and increased their rate of fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions surrounding the bridge, As she finished treating the first Marine's leg wound, a new barrage of gunfire erupted from directly overhead. The insurgents had positioned snipers in the abandoned buildings nearby, and they now had a clear view of Sarah's position. She realized with growing horror that she had become a primary target, caught in the open with wounded soldiers who couldn't move quickly. The bullets seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, and Sarah knew that their situation had gone from dangerous to potentially fatal. She looked toward the hills where the SEAL team that was supposed to provide overwatch for their mission should have been positioned, but there was no sign of the elite soldiers who were meant to be their ace in the hole. Unknown to Sarah, the SEAL team had been delayed by their own firefight several miles away. They were racing toward the convoy's position, but time was running out for the brave medic who had put herself in harm's way to save her fellow service members. The sniper's bullet struck Sarah in the shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer, spinning her around and sending her medical kit flying across the dusty ground. She hit the concrete hard, her vision blurring as pain exploded through her body. The wounded Marine she had been treating reached out to help her, but another burst of gunfire forced him to take cover behind a concrete pillar. Blood was flowing freely from Sarah's shoulder wound, but she forced herself to stay conscious. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, she could hear Lieutenant Colonel Harrison screaming her name over the radio. The convoy was pinned down, and the insurgents were moving closer to their position, emboldened by their success in hitting the American medic. Sarah tried to apply pressure to her own wound, but her left arm wasn't responding properly. The bullet had damaged nerves and muscle, making it nearly impossible to use. She could feel herself getting weaker as blood loss began to take its toll. The other wounded Marines were calling for help, but she could barely help herself. The insurgents had planned their ambush perfectly. They knew that American forces would never leave wounded soldiers behind, so hitting the medic was a strategic move designed to create chaos and force the Americans into desperate rescue attempts. Sarah realized with growing dread that she had become the bait in a deadly trap. Another bullet struck the concrete inches from her head, followed by two more that found their mark in her abdomen. The pain was indescribable, but what terrified Sarah most was the warm sensation spreading across her stomach. She knew enough about battlefield medicine to understand that abdominal wounds were often fatal, without immediate surgical intervention. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was coordinating with the helicopter support, but the aircraft couldn't land in the middle of the firefight. The insurgents had positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Sarah could hear the frustration in Harrison's voice as he tried to find a way to save his people. The fourth bullet caught Sarah in the leg, shattering her femur and sending waves of agony through her entire body. She was now hit in 3 different locations, bleeding heavily and trapped in an exposed position with no cover. The wounded Marines near her were trying to return fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah's radio had been damaged in the fall, but she could still hear the chatter from the other units. Emergency medical evacuation was at least 20 minutes away, and the convoy didn't have enough ammunition to hold their position that long. The insurgents were already probing their defenses, looking for weak points to exploit. Through the chaos and pain, Sarah heard a new sound that made her heart race with hope. The distant roar of motorcycle engines echoed across the desert, but her relief quickly turned to horror as she realized what it meant. The insurgents were bringing in reinforcements, and motorcycles meant they could move quickly and strike from multiple directions. The 5th and 6th bullets hit Sarah almost simultaneously, one in her other shoulder and another in her side. She was now bleeding from 6 different wounds, and her vision was starting to fade around the edges. The pain was so intense that it almost felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's nightmare. Unsolved, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made the desperate decision to leave the safety of his vehicle and attempt to reach Sarah. He sprinted across the exposed ground, drawing heavy fire from the insurgent positions. Sarah watched in horror as bullets struck the ground around him, knowing that her commanding officer was risking his life to save her. Harrison reached Sarah's position and immediately began assessing her wounds. Even with his limited medical training, he could see that she was in critical condition. 7 bullets had found their mark, and she was losing blood faster than her body could compensate. He applied pressure to the worst wounds while calling for immediate evacuation. The 8th bullet struck Sarah in the chest, and she felt something fundamental change inside her body. Breathing became difficult and she could taste blood in her mouth. Harrison's face went pale as he realized that the bullet had likely punctured her lung. Without proper medical equipment, there was little he could do except try to keep her conscious. Sarah managed to whisper instructions to Harrison about treating the other wounded Marines. Even as her own life was slipping away, her training and dedication to helping others remained strong. She told him where to find the morphine in her medical kit and how to properly apply tourniquets to control bleeding. The 9th and 10th bullets came from a different direction as the insurgents flanked their position. Sarah felt the impact but could no longer distinguish between different sources of pain. Her body was shutting down, conserving energy for vital functions as it tried to keep her alive. Harrison continued applying pressure to her wounds, but both of them knew it wasn't enough. Sarah's thoughts drifted to her family back home in Texas. Her parents had been so proud when she graduated from medical school and decided to serve her country. Her younger brother had just started college, and she wondered if she would ever see him again. The wedding ring on her finger caught the sunlight, reminding her of her husband who was deployed with the army in Afghanistan. The 11th bullet struck her in the arm, followed quickly by the 12th and 13th rounds that hit her legs. Sarah could no longer feel most of her body, which was both a blessing and a terrifying sign. Harrison was speaking to her, trying to keep her conscious, but his voice seemed to be coming from very far away. As the 14th bullet found its mark in her side, Sarah felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. The last thing she remembered was Harrison's voice on the radio, desperately calling for the SEAL team that was supposed to be providing overwatch. She didn't know that the elite soldiers were fighting their own battle several miles away, racing against time to reach the trapped convoy. The insurgents were now moving closer to finish off the wounded Americans. They had achieved their objective of creating a devastating ambush, but they hadn't counted on the determination of the American forces to never leave anyone behind. Unknown to Sarah and Harrison, help was finally on the way, but it might already be too late for the brave medic who had sacrificed everything to save her fellow soldiers. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez felt his blood turn cold as the radio transmission crackled through his headset. The SEAL team had been tracking a high-value target in the hills east of Fallujah when the desperate call for help came through. A Navy medic was down, hit multiple times, and the convoy was trapped in a kill zone with mounting casualties. Rodriguez looked at his team of 5 elite operators, each one a veteran of multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. They had been pursuing insurgent leaders for 3 days, following intelligence that could lead to a major breakthrough in the region. But hearing that one of their own was dying changed everything. The mission would have to wait. Team leader Lieutenant Jake Morrison made the decision without hesitation. They would abandon their current objective and move to assist the trapped convoy. The SEAL team was positioned approximately 2 miles from the ambush site, but the terrain between them was rough and potentially filled with enemy fighters who might have been left behind to prevent exactly this type of rescue. The team moved with practiced efficiency, covering ground at a pace that would exhaust most soldiers. Rodriguez carried the team's medical supplies, knowing that every second counted for the wounded medic. Behind him, Petty Officer First Class David Chen monitored radio chatter, trying to get a clearer picture of the situation at the convoy. As they crested a ridge overlooking the ambush site, the SEALs could see the full scope of the disaster. The convoy was pinned down on the bridge with insurgent fighters positioned in a semicircle around their location. Smoke was rising from the lead vehicle, and they could see several figures lying motionless on the ground. Morrison quickly assessed the tactical situation through his scope. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site well, with natural cover and multiple escape routes. But they had made one critical mistake. They had become so focused on finishing off the Americans that they hadn't maintained proper security on their flanks. The SEAL team split into 2 groups to attack from different directions. Morrison, Rodriguez, and Chen would approach from the north, while the other 3 team members would circle around to attack from the south. The plan was to create confusion and draw fire away from the trapped convoy long enough for a medical evacuation helicopter to land. Rodriguez could see a figure in American uniform lying motionless in the center of the bridge. Even at this distance, he could tell that the person was badly wounded, with dark stains spreading across the concrete around them. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was crouched nearby, still trying to provide aid while taking cover from the ongoing gunfire. The first phase of the SEAL assault began with precision sniper fire from their southern team. 2 insurgent fighters dropped instantly, their weapons falling silent. The sudden shift in the battle's momentum caused confusion among the remaining insurgents, who began looking for the new threat instead of focusing on the trapped convoy. Rodriguez and his group moved down the hillside like ghosts, using every piece of available cover to get closer to the bridge. They could hear Harrison on the radio, pleading for immediate medical evacuation. The medic they were trying to save had been unconscious for several minutes, and her vital signs were becoming increasingly weak. The SEAL's northern assault began with a coordinated attack on the insurgent positions overlooking the bridge. Rodriguez moved with deadly efficiency, his training taking over as he engaged multiple targets. The insurgents had been expecting a static defense from the convoy, not a coordinated assault from elite special operations forces. Within minutes, the tactical situation had completely reversed. The insurgents found themselves caught between the defending convoy and the attacking SEALs, with their carefully planned ambush collapsing around them. Several fighters attempted to flee, but the SEALs had positioned themselves to cut off all escape routes. Rodriguez reached the bridge just as the last of the insurgent resistance was being eliminated. He immediately sprinted toward the wounded medic, his medical training taking precedence over everything else. What he saw when he reached Sarah's position made his stomach turn. She had been hit 14 times and had lost an enormous amount of blood. Working quickly, Rodriguez began assessing Sarah's wounds while Morrison coordinated with the incoming medical evacuation helicopter. Her pulse was barely detectable and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Rodriguez knew that she needed immediate surgery and blood transfusions to have any chance of survival. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived within minutes of the SEALs securing the area. The pilot had to navigate carefully around the damaged vehicles and debris scattered across the bridge. Rodriguez and the flight medic worked together to stabilize Sarah for transport, knowing that the flight to the nearest field hospital would be her only chance. As they loaded Sarah into the helicopter, Rodriguez noticed something that gave him hope. Despite everything she had endured, she was still wearing her medical insignia and had her stethoscope around her neck. Even unconscious and critically wounded, she looked like someone who had dedicated her life to saving others. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison climbed into the helicopter with Sarah, refusing to leave his wounded medic behind. He had been hit twice during the firefight but had continued fighting to protect his people. Rodriguez respected the officer's loyalty, even though it meant less room in the aircraft for medical equipment. The helicopter lifted off from the bridge, carrying Sarah toward what everyone hoped would be life-saving medical care. Rodriguez watched the aircraft disappear into the distance, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether their rescue mission had been successful. He had seen many wounded soldiers over the years, but something about this medic's courage had affected him deeply. Morrison gathered the SEAL team for their extraction, but Rodriguez found himself thinking about the wounded medic. She had put herself in harm's way to save other soldiers, and now her own life hung in the balance. He wondered about her family, her background, and what had motivated her to become a combat medic in one of the world's most dangerous places. The extraction helicopter arrived to collect the SEAL team, but Rodriguez knew that their mission wasn't over. Sarah Martinez had become more than just another casualty to them. She represented everything they fought to protect: courage, selflessness, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. Rodriguez made a silent promise that they would check on her recovery and make sure she received the recognition she deserved for her heroism under fire. The trauma bay at Forward Operating Base Liberty erupted into controlled chaos as Sarah's helicopter touched down. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chief trauma surgeon, had been briefed during the flight about the incoming patient. 14 gunshot wounds, massive blood loss, and vital signs that were barely sustaining life. She had seen thousands of wounded soldiers, but this case would test every skill she had learned in 20 years of emergency medicine. Sarah was unconscious as the medical team rushed her into the operating room. Her face was pale as parchment and her uniform was soaked with blood. Dr. Foster quickly assessed the wounds while her team prepared for emergency surgery. The damage was extensive: punctured lung, damaged liver, shattered femur, and multiple entry and exit wounds that had caused internal bleeding. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had insisted on staying at the hospital, despite his own injuries. He paced the waiting area, still wearing his blood-stained uniform, while doctors worked to save Sarah's life. The guilt was eating him alive. He had ordered the mission that put her in danger, and he had watched helplessly as she was shot multiple times while trying to save other soldiers. Dr. Foster worked with mechanical precision, her hands moving with the confidence that came from years of battlefield surgery. Sarah's blood pressure kept dropping despite multiple transfusions, and her heart rate was becoming dangerously irregular. The surgical team knew they were racing against time, trying to repair damage faster than Sarah's body was failing. 3 hours into the surgery, Sarah's heart stopped. Dr. Foster immediately began chest compressions while her team prepared the defibrillator. The steady beep of the heart monitor had been replaced by the flat line that every medical professional dreaded. For 90 seconds, that felt like hours. Sarah was clinically dead while the medical team fought to bring her back. The defibrillator shocked Sarah's heart back into rhythm, but Dr. Foster knew they weren't out of danger yet. The trauma had caused extensive internal bleeding, and several organs had been damaged beyond what field surgery could fully repair. Sarah would need to be evacuated to a major medical center in Germany for specialized care, assuming she survived the next few hours. Harrison received updates throughout the night as Sarah underwent multiple surgeries. Each time, the news was cautiously optimistic, but highlighted the severity of her condition. She had lost over half her blood volume and would require months of rehabilitation even if she survived. The doctors were amazed that anyone could survive 14 gunshot wounds, especially while providing medical care to others during the attack. 2 days after the ambush, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez arrived at the hospital to check on Sarah's condition. He had been thinking about the brave medic since the rescue, and his SEAL team wanted to know how she was recovering. What he learned from Dr. Foster surprised him. Sarah was not only alive but was showing signs of improvement that defied medical expectations. Rodriguez was allowed to visit Sarah's room, though she was still unconscious and connected to multiple machines that monitored her vital signs. He stood quietly by her bedside, thinking about the courage she had shown during the ambush. The woman lying in the hospital bed looked small and fragile, nothing like the determined medic who had risked everything to save her fellow soldiers. Harrison joined Rodriguez in Sarah's room, and the two men shared their thoughts about the ambush and its aftermath. Rodriguez learned that Sarah had been in Iraq for 8 months and had already earned a reputation for exceptional bravery and medical skill. She had saved dozens of lives during her deployment, often putting herself in danger to reach wounded soldiers. Dr. Foster explained that Sarah's survival was medically remarkable. The combination of her physical fitness, medical training, and sheer determination had kept her alive long enough for rescue and surgery. But the doctor also warned that Sarah faced a long and difficult recovery, with the possibility of permanent disabilities from her extensive injuries. On her 3rd day in the hospital, Sarah briefly regained consciousness. Her first words were asking about the wounded Marines from the convoy, demonstrating that her concern for others remained strong even after her own near-death experience. Harrison was able to tell her that all the Marines had survived, thanks in large part to the medical care she had provided under fire. Sarah's family was notified of her injuries and began making arrangements to travel to Germany, where she would be transferred for additional surgery. Her husband, deployed with the army in Afghanistan, received emergency leave to be with his wife. Her parents struggled to understand how their daughter, who had become a doctor to help people, had ended up in a war zone fighting for her life. The story of Sarah's heroism began to spread throughout the military community. Soldiers who had never met her were inspired by accounts of the medic who continued treating wounded soldiers even after being shot multiple times. Her actions embodied the military medical corps' motto, to conserve the fighting strength, even at the cost of her own safety. Rodriguez and his SEAL team made a decision that surprised their commanding officers. They requested permission to escort Sarah during her medical evacuation to Germany, wanting to ensure that the woman who had shown such courage received the protection and respect she deserved. The request was approved, recognizing the special bond that had formed between the rescuers and the rescued. As Sarah was prepared for transport to Germany, her condition had stabilized enough for the journey. She remained unconscious but was breathing on her own, and her vital signs were stronger. Dr. Foster cautiously optimistic that Sarah would survive, though the extent of her recovery remained uncertain. Harrison wrote a detailed report of Sarah's actions during the ambush, recommending her for the highest military decorations available. He described how she had voluntarily left safety to treat wounded soldiers and had continued providing medical care even after being shot multiple times. Her selfless actions had saved lives and demonstrated extraordinary courage under the most dangerous circumstances. The medical evacuation flight to Germany carried Sarah away from the desert where she had nearly died. Rodriguez and his SEAL team traveled with her, forming an honor guard for a fellow warrior who had proven that heroism came in many forms. As the aircraft climbed into the sky, they all hoped that Sarah's story was far from over and that her recovery would be as remarkable as her survival. The medical facility at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany had treated thousands of wounded warriors, but Sarah's case drew special attention from the entire staff. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the head of trauma reconstruction, had reviewed her medical files during the flight from Iraq and was amazed that anyone could survive such extensive injuries. 14 gunshot wounds with massive internal damage should have been fatal. Yet Sarah was not only alive but showing signs of remarkable resilience. Sarah's husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Martinez, arrived at Landstuhl just hours after her transport plane landed. He had been granted emergency leave from his deployment in Afghanistan and had flown through multiple time zones to reach his wife's bedside. The man who had served 2 combat tours himself was unprepared for the sight of his wife connected to machines and fighting for her life. Michael sat by Sarah's bedside for hours, talking to her even though she remained unconscious. He told her about their home in Texas, their plans for after their deployments ended, and how proud he was of her service. The doctors had explained that comatose patients could sometimes hear voices of loved ones, and Michael was determined to give Sarah every reason to fight her way back to consciousness. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez and his SEAL team had been granted special permission to remain at Landstuhl for several days to monitor Sarah's progress. Rodriguez found himself drawn to her story and wanted to ensure that she received the recognition she deserved for her heroism. He had contacted his superiors about recommending Sarah for the Navy Cross, one of the highest military decorations for valor. Sarah's parents, Robert and Maria Martinez, arrived from Texas after a difficult journey that included flight delays and complications with military clearances. Seeing their daughter in the intensive care unit was heartbreaking for parents who remembered the little girl who had always wanted to help injured animals and had dreamed of becoming a doctor to save lives. Dr. Muller began a series of reconstructive surgeries designed to repair the extensive damage to Sarah's body. The operations were complex and risky, requiring specialists in orthopedic surgery, vascular repair, and internal medicine. Each surgery carried the possibility of complications that could set back her recovery or even threaten her life again. On her 5th day at Landstuhl, Sarah experienced a medical crisis that sent alarms throughout the intensive care unit. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and she developed signs of infection that suggested one of her wounds was not healing properly. Dr. Muller and his team worked frantically to stabilize her condition, while her family waited in agonizing uncertainty. The crisis lasted 18 hours before Sarah's condition began to improve. The infection had been caught early enough to prevent sepsis, but it served as a stark reminder of how fragile her recovery remained. Michael never left her side during the medical emergency, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, even when the doctors warned that she might not survive the night. Rodriguez used his time at Landstuhl to gather detailed information about Sarah's actions during the ambush. He interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and the other Marines who had witnessed her heroism, building a comprehensive record of her courage under fire. The SEAL team leader was determined to ensure that Sarah's story would be properly documented and recognized. Sarah's unconsciousness lasted for 12 days, during which time her family maintained a constant vigil by her bedside. Michael read to her from letters sent by her medical school classmates and fellow service members who had heard about her injuries. Messages of support poured in from around the world, from people who had been inspired by accounts of her selfless actions. The moment Sarah finally opened her eyes was witnessed by Michael, her parents, and Rodriguez, who had been visiting when she began to stir. Her first words were characteristically focused on others. She asked about the wounded Marines from the convoy before expressing any concern about her own condition. Even after nearly dying, Her instinct was to care for fellow soldiers. Dr. Muller was cautiously optimistic about Sarah's awakening, but he explained that she faced months of rehabilitation and multiple additional surgeries. The damage to her leg would require extensive reconstruction, and she would need to relearn basic motor skills that had been affected by her injuries. The road to recovery would be long and difficult, requiring the same determination she had shown during the ambush. Sarah's first few days of consciousness were difficult as she struggled with pain, confusion, and the reality of her extensive injuries. She had no memory of being shot or of the rescue by Rodriguez and his SEAL team. The trauma had created gaps in her memory that might never be fully recovered, leaving her with questions about events that had nearly cost her life. Rodriguez spent time with Sarah, explaining how his team had found her and describing the courage she had shown during the ambush. Sarah listened with amazement to accounts of her own actions, struggling to reconcile the heroic story with her own fragmented memories. She was particularly moved to learn that she had continued treating wounded soldiers even after being shot multiple times. The medical staff at Landstuhl was impressed by Sarah's positive attitude and determination to recover. Despite facing the possibility of permanent disabilities and a long rehabilitation process, she maintained the same spirit that had driven her to become a combat medic. She immediately began asking about when she could return to duty, though the doctors knew that her combat service was almost certainly over. Michael made the difficult decision to request a transfer closer to Landstuhl so he could be near Sarah during her recovery. The military approved his request, recognizing the exceptional circumstances and the importance of family support during such a critical period. His presence gave Sarah strength and motivation during the darkest moments of her rehabilitation. Sarah's story began to spread beyond the military community as news organizations picked up accounts of the medic who had survived 14 gunshot wounds. Her heroism resonated with people around the world who were inspired by her selfless dedication to saving others. Letters and packages began arriving at the hospital from strangers who wanted to support her recovery. Rodriguez and his SEAL team prepared to return to duty, but they made a promise to Sarah that they would stay in contact during her recovery. The bond formed during the rescue had created a lasting connection between the elite warriors and the brave medic they had saved. Rodriguez assured Sarah that she would always be considered part of their extended military family. 18 months after the ambush in Fallujah, Sarah Martinez stood on the stage at the Pentagon, supported by specially designed leg braces but standing on her own strength. The ceremony had drawn military officials, family members, and members of the media who had followed her remarkable story of survival and recovery. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez and his SEAL team were in the front row, watching with pride as the woman they had rescued received the recognition she deserved. The Secretary of the Navy stepped forward to present Sarah with the Navy Cross, citing her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty during the ambush. The citation read aloud to the assembled audience described how she had voluntarily exposed herself to enemy fire to treat wounded Marines and had continued providing medical care even after being shot 14 times. Her actions had saved multiple lives and exemplified the highest traditions of military service. Sarah's recovery had been longer and more difficult than anyone had anticipated. She had undergone 17 separate surgeries to repair damage to her organs, bones, and circulatory system. Physical therapy had been a daily struggle as she worked to regain mobility and strengthen her damaged limbs. There were times when the pain and frustration had nearly overwhelmed her determination to recover. Michael had been by her side throughout the entire process, taking leave when possible, and supporting her through the darkest moments of rehabilitation. Their marriage had been tested by the trauma and its aftermath, but they had emerged stronger and more committed to each other. Michael often said that the woman who had survived 14 gunshot wounds was even more amazing than the one he had originally married. Sarah's parents had relocated to Germany during her initial recovery and had been a constant source of strength and encouragement. They had watched their daughter struggle with basic tasks that had once been simple, celebrating small victories like taking her first steps with assistance or being able to write her name with her rebuilt hand. Their faith in her recovery had never wavered, even during the most discouraging setbacks. Rodriguez had visited Sarah regularly during her rehabilitation, bringing updates from his SEAL team and sharing stories about their ongoing missions. He had become like a big brother to Sarah, offering encouragement during difficult physical therapy sessions and helping her maintain perspective during the frustrating aspects of recovery. The bond formed during the rescue had evolved into a lasting friendship. The medical team at Landstuhl had been amazed by Sarah's progress, though her recovery had required innovations in trauma care and rehabilitation techniques. Dr. Muller had written several papers about her case, contributing to medical knowledge that would help future patients with similar injuries. Sarah had participated willingly in research studies, hoping that her experience could benefit other wounded warriors. Sarah's story had inspired changes in military medical training and protocols. Her actions during the ambush had been studied to identify factors that contributed to her survival and effective medical care under fire. Training programs now included scenarios based on her experience, teaching medics how to continue functioning effectively even when wounded themselves. The psychological recovery had been as challenging as the physical rehabilitation. Sarah had experienced survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress related to the ambush and its aftermath. Counseling had helped her process the trauma and understand that her survival was not a matter of chance but a result of her training, determination, and the efforts of those who had rescued and treated her. Sarah had been medically retired from active duty, but she had found new ways to serve her country and fellow veterans. She had become a spokesperson for wounded warrior programs and had testified before Congress about the needs of service members recovering from combat injuries. Her first-hand experience with trauma and recovery made her a powerful advocate for improved medical care and support services. The transition to civilian life had been difficult for someone who had dedicated her adult life to military service. Sarah had returned to school to complete specialized training in trauma counseling, planning to work with other veterans struggling with combat-related injuries and psychological trauma. Her own experience gave her unique insights into the challenges faced by wounded warriors. Rodriguez had been promoted and was now leading his own SEAL team, but he maintained regular contact with Sarah and considered her recovery one of his most important missions accomplished. He had spoken at military academies about the rescue operation, emphasizing the importance of never leaving anyone behind and the extraordinary courage displayed by combat medics like Sarah. The ceremony at the Pentagon concluded with Sarah addressing the audience, her voice strong despite the emotional weight of the moment. She spoke about the Marines who had been saved during the ambush and emphasized that her actions were simply what any medic would have done in the same situation. Her humility and grace impressed everyone present, reinforcing why she had been chosen for such high recognition. Sarah's speech focused on the importance of supporting wounded warriors and their families during recovery. She described the challenges she had faced and the people who had made her survival and recovery possible. She specifically thanked Rodriguez and his SEAL team, the medical personnel who had treated her, and her family for their unwavering support throughout her ordeal. After the ceremony, Sarah and Michael returned to their home in Texas, where they had built a new life centered around helping other veterans. Sarah worked part-time at a veterans hospital, providing counseling and support to service members dealing with combat trauma. Her unique perspective as both a medical professional and a wounded warrior made her exceptionally effective in this role. The house they had built was specially designed to accommodate Sarah's physical limitations while maintaining her independence. She still walked with a slight limp and had limited mobility in one arm, but she had adapted to these challenges with the same determination she had shown during her military service. Physical therapy remained a part of her daily routine, helping her maintain and improve her capabilities. Sarah and Michael had started a foundation to support the families of wounded service members, understanding firsthand the challenges faced by loved ones during extended medical treatment and rehabilitation. The foundation provided financial assistance, counseling services, and practical support to help families navigate the complex world of military medical care and benefits. Rodriguez visited Sarah and Michael annually on the anniversary of the ambush, a tradition that had become important to all of them. These visits allowed them to remember the events that had brought them together, while celebrating Sarah's continued recovery and achievements. Rodriguez often brought members of his team, introducing them to the woman whose courage had inspired their own service. The Marines who had been saved during the ambush maintained contact with Sarah, forming an extended military family united by their shared experience. Several of them had completed their military service and pursued careers inspired by Sarah's example of service and dedication. They credited her actions with not only saving their lives but showing them what true heroism looked like. Sarah's medical records had become part of military medical research, contributing to improved treatment protocols for combat casualties. Her survival from 14 gunshot wounds had challenged conventional medical wisdom and led to new approaches in trauma care that had saved other lives. She took pride in knowing that her experience continued to help other wounded warriors. The nightmares about the ambush had gradually decreased over time, though Sarah still experienced occasional flashbacks triggered by loud noises or stressful situations. She had learned coping strategies through therapy and maintained her mental health through continued counseling and support from other veterans who understood her experiences. Sarah's story had been featured in books, documentaries, and military training materials, but she remained focused on the present rather than dwelling on past events. She understood that her survival had given her a platform to help others, and she used that opportunity responsibly to advocate for improved care and support for wounded warriors and their families. As Sarah looked toward the future, she felt grateful for the second chance she had been given and determined to make the most of it. The young woman who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor to help people had evolved into someone whose impact extended far beyond traditional medical practice. Her courage, resilience, and dedication continued to inspire others long after the guns had fallen silent in Fallujah. The legacy of that terrible day on the bridge had transformed from tragedy into triumph, demonstrating that even in war's darkest moments, human courage and compassion could prevail. Sarah Martinez had become living proof that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to give up when everything seems lost.